March 29th, 1461, Palm Sunday. A snowstorm was building over Yorkshire as two massive armies prepared to destroy each other. By sunset, 28,000 men would be dead in the snow. It remains the bloodiest battle ever fought on British soil. Yet somehow, most people have never even heard its name. This is the story of Towton, and what happened in that snowstorm changed England forever. Welcome to Britain's history. Today we're diving into a battle so brutal, so devastating. The contemporary chronicles called it a great conflict which surpassed all the battles that had ever been fought in England. Because Towton wasn't just about two noble houses fighting for a crown. It was about the complete and utter destruction of one side by the other, no quarter given, no mercy shown, just relentless slaughter in the snow until one army ceased to exist. But before we get to the killing fields, before we watch the largest medieval armies ever assembled in Britain tear each other apart in a blizzard, we need to understand how England descended into this nightmare. Because without knowing what brought 75,000 men to a frozen Yorkshire plateau on Palm Sunday, you can't fully appreciate the savagery of what happened when they finally met in battle. And if you're enjoying this deep dive into history, make sure you're subscribed. We've got dozens more forgotten battles lined up, each one as brutal and dramatic as Towton. Don't miss them. The Wars of the Roses began in 1455, though tensions had been building for decades before the first blood was spilled. Two branches of the royal Plantagenet family, Lancaster and York, both claimed legitimate right to the English throne. The Lancastrians, represented by the Red Rose, held power under King Henry VI. But Henry was catastrophically weak, prone to devastating mental breakdowns that left him catatonic for months at a time, unable to recognize his own wife or child. He was controlled by unpopular advisors who enriched themselves while England suffered defeats in France and chaos at home. The Yorkists, symbolized by the white rose and led by Richard, Duke of York, believed they had a superior bloodline claim to the throne, and certainly possessed vastly better leadership. The origins of the conflict lay in the constitutional chaos of the previous century. Richard II had been deposed and murdered in 1399 by Henry IV, a usurpation that created lasting questions about legitimacy and the right to rule. The Lancastrian kings, Henry IV, Henry V, and Henry VI, ruled through a mixture of military force and grudging acceptance. But when Henry VI proved utterly incompetent, old questions resurfaced with deadly urgency. If the Lancastrians could take the throne by force, why couldn't the Yorkists do the same? Think about that for a second. If your legitimate claim to power comes from someone who seized power illegitimately, do you actually have legitimacy? The English nobility would kill each other for decades trying to answer that question. What do you think? Does might make right when it comes to kingship? Let me know in the comments. For 6 long years, the war sputtered along with sporadic battles and constantly shifting allegiances. Nobles changed sides based on immediate advantage rather than any fixed principle. Neither faction could deliver a knockout blow. Battles were won and lost, territory changed hands, but the fundamental conflict remained unresolved. The country bled slowly, exhausting itself in a war that seemed to have no end. Then, in December 1460, everything changed in the most brutal way imaginable. Richard, Duke of York, was killed at the Battle of Wakefield, caught by surprise, and slaughtered along with his second son Edmund. The Lancastrians didn't just kill him, they humiliated him. Richard's head, crowned with a paper crown in vicious mockery of his royal ambitions, was displayed on the gates of York City for everyone to see. His son Edward, just 18 years old, inherited the Yorkist cause and a burning, all-consuming desire for revenge that would shape everything that followed. Edward of York wasn't just angry, he was dangerous. At 6 feet 4 inches tall, in an age when most men barely reached 5.5 feet, Edward towered over everyone around him. He was extraordinarily handsome, naturally charismatic, and a born warrior who'd already won battles despite his extreme youth. Where his father had been cautious and calculating, Edward was bold, decisive, and willing to take enormous risks. Where Henry VI was weak, indecisive, and frequently incapable of basic functions, Edward radiated confidence, strength, and an almost supernatural ability to inspire loyalty in his followers. In February 1461, Edward won a brutal victory at Mortimer's Cross in Wales, defeating a substantial Lancastrian force and personally supervising the execution of captured nobles. He showed no mercy, no hesitation. Then, demonstrating the audacity that would define his reign, he marched to London and did something that shocked England. He had himself proclaimed King Edward IV, not waiting for a formal coronation, not seeking Parliament's blessing, not going through any of the traditional ceremonies. He simply declared himself king and dared anyone to challenge his claim. He was 19 years old and acted like he'd been born to rule. The Lancastrian response was immediate and massive. Queen Margaret of Anjou, Henry VI's formidable French wife, was the real power behind the Lancastrian throne. She was everything her husband wasn't: intelligent, ruthless, politically brilliant, and absolutely determined to preserve her son's inheritance. She assembled the largest army the Lancastrians had ever fielded, drawing soldiers from their northern strongholds and promising them plunder. If they marched south, they won a victory at Second St. Albans, briefly recaptured the helpless Henry VI from Yorkist custody, and advanced toward London with what seemed like unstoppable momentum. But London's gates stayed firmly closed. The city feared the Lancastrian army, filled with northern soldiers who'd already plundered their way south, looting towns and terrorizing civilians. The tales of their brutality had reached London before they did, and the merchants and guilds who controlled the city wanted no part of them. Edward, moving with the characteristic speed and decisiveness that would define his military career, raced north from London with his own massive army. He knew with absolute certainty that he needed to destroy the Lancastrians before they could consolidate their forces, regroup in their northern strongholds, and continue threatening his newly claimed throne. He needed a decisive battle that would end the Lancastrian threat permanently, and he needed it immediately. The two armies converged on Yorkshire in late March 1461, like two thunderstorms moving toward an inevitable collision. Edward commanded perhaps 36,000 men, the largest military force a York king would ever field in the entire war. The Lancastrians, under the Duke of Somerset and the Earl of Northumberland, numbered close to 40,000. These weren't the small medieval skirmishes of a few thousand men that characterized earlier warfare. This was total war on a scale England had rarely seen, with both sides committing virtually everything they had in one massive throw of the dice. On March 28th, the armies manoeuvred near the small village of Towton in Yorkshire. The location was unremarkable. Rolling plateau land, good for farming, with a slight slope down toward a stream called the River Cock. But it was about to become the site of the bloodiest day in British military history. That night, as both armies made camp, a snowstorm began. Bitter winds drove snow horizontally across the open plateau. Men huddled in whatever shelter they could find, shivering in their armor, knowing that tomorrow they'd have to fight in conditions that would test the absolute limits of human endurance. Palm Sunday, March 29th, 1461, dawned grey, bitter, and brutal. The snowstorm hadn't abated. If anything, it had intensified. Howling winds from the south drove snow so thick that visibility was measured in yards rather than miles. The Lancastrians held the marginally better position, deployed on a low plateau with their backs to Towton village. The ground sloped gently upward toward them, meaning the Yorkists would have to attack uphill into the wind and driving snow against an enemy they could barely see. Around 9 a.m., with dawn light barely penetrating the storm, the Yorkists began their advance. But Edward faced a serious problem. He was outnumbered by several thousand men, forced to attack uphill, and the snow was so blinding that his soldiers could barely see 20 feet ahead. It seemed like a recipe for disaster. Then Lord Fauconberg, one of Edward's most experienced commanders, implemented one of the cleverest tactical moves of the entire Wars of the Roses. Fauconberg ordered his archers, several thousand of the best longbowmen in England, to advance within extreme range of the Lancastrian lines. Then he had them loose massed volleys of arrows high into the air. The wind, howling from the south directly into the Lancastrian faces, carried those arrows far beyond their normal range. They arced through the blizzard and fell like deadly rain into the Lancastrian army. Men began falling, struck by arrows they couldn't see coming through the thick snow, wounded or killed by an enemy they couldn't even locate to fight back against. The Lancastrians responded exactly as Fauconberg had hoped. Their commanders, seeing their men falling and unable to spot the source, ordered their own archers to return fire. Thousands of Lancastrian arrows were loosed toward where they thought the Yorkist lines must be. But here's where Fauconberg's plan became absolutely brilliant. The Lancastrian arrows, fired into the brutal south wind, fell pathetically short. They landed harmlessly in the snow, in the space between the two armies. Fauconberg's men simply walked forward through the storm, collected the fallen arrows by the thousands, and shot them back at their original owners. The Lancastrians were steadily running out of ammunition, while the Yorkists had an endless supply, courtesy of their enemies' own supplies. After nearly an hour of this brutally one-sided archery exchange, with Lancastrian casualties mounting and their arrow supplies dwindling to nothing, the Lancastrian commanders realized they were being systematically bled to death. They had no choice. They had to attack, to close the distance and engage in hand-to-hand combat where their superior numbers would count. They ordered their massive army forward, downhill, into the teeth of the wind and snow, to close with the Yorkist lines and end this before they lost more men to invisible arrows. What followed was the largest hand-to-hand battle ever fought on British soil. Approximately 75,000 men crashed together in a melee that stretched across a front nearly a mile wide. The noise must have been absolutely overwhelming. The screaming of wounded and dying men, the clash of thousands of weapons striking armor and shields, the shouted orders that were immediately lost in the howling wind and the chaos of battle. Medieval warfare at this massive scale was brutality almost beyond modern comprehension. Men fought with swords, war axes, billhooks, pole axes, and every conceivable weapon designed to kill other men wearing armor. Plate armor could stop many blows, but a well-aimed strike from a poleaxe could crush skulls even through helmets, sever limbs despite armor, or drive spear points through the gaps between plates into vulnerable flesh beneath. The wounded fell into the trampled, blood-soaked snow and were crushed under the press of thousands of bodies pushing forward. The pristine white snow turned crimson, then black with blood and mud. The battle lines were compressed so tightly that men could barely swing their weapons properly. It devolved into a nightmarish shoving match, each side trying desperately to push the other back while stabbing at any exposed flesh with daggers and short weapons. Exhaustion set in with terrifying speed. Fighting in full armor in a snowstorm while trying not to slip and fall in blood-soaked snow drained even the strongest men within minutes. But there was nowhere to rest, no possibility of retreat. The lines just kept pushing against each other in brutal stalemate, men dying by the hundreds as the hours ground on. Try to imagine actually being there, freezing, exhausted, can't see 20 feet. Your friends are dying around you, and you're fighting other Englishmen over which nobleman gets a crown. Would you have kept fighting, or would you have dropped your weapon and run? Be honest in the comments. For 3 hours, neither side gained appreciable ground. The Lancastrians had superior numbers. The Yorkists had desperate determination. They knew with absolute certainty that losing this battle meant death, not just military defeat. There would be no quarter, no mercy, no possibility of surrender and survival. Edward IV himself, barely 19 years old, fought in the front lines alongside his men. Contemporary accounts describe him fighting like a hero from legend, his enormous height making him visible even in the storm, inspiring his soldiers through personal example and seemingly impossible bravery. Then, around 1 p.m., after 3 hours of the most brutal fighting anyone could remember, the battle's turning point finally arrived. The Duke of Norfolk appeared on the Lancastrian left flank with fresh Yorkist reinforcements. Historians still debate exactly how many men Norfolk brought. Estimates range from 3,000 to 9,000. But their arrival was absolutely devastating. They crashed into the Lancastrian left wing, which was already exhausted from 3 hours of brutal hand-to-hand combat, cold, scared, and running on nothing but willpower. The Lancastrian line began to buckle under this fresh assault. Units that had held firm for hours suddenly started breaking apart. And once medieval battle lines break, systematic massacre inevitably follows. The Lancastrians began to retreat, then to rout, then to flee in absolute panic. The Yorkists pursued with methodical savagery, cutting down exhausted men who couldn't run anymore, who could barely lift their weapons to defend themselves. The slaughter was systematic and merciless. Yorkist cavalry ran down fleeing infantry like hunting dogs after rabbits. Groups of soldiers were surrounded and butchered where they stood. The Lancastrians fled south toward Towton village and beyond toward the River Cock. But there was no escape waiting for them. The Cock was swollen with snowmelt, running deep, fast, and deadly cold. Men threw themselves into the water anyway, preferring the possibility of drowning to the certainty of Yorkist blades. So many bodies piled up in and around the river that later chronicles spoke of bridges of corpses spanning the water, of the river running red for days afterward. Edward IV had reportedly given orders before the battle, take no prisoners, show no quarter. Every Lancastrian was to be killed. Whether this order was actually given, or whether it simply reflected how medieval battles typically ended, is unclear, but the result was identical. The killing continued until darkness made it impossible to see. Men were hunted through the snow and twilight, dragged from hiding places in woods and villages, and executed where they stood or knelt begging for mercy that never came. The casualties were staggering, even by the brutal standards of medieval warfare. Contemporary sources claim 28,000 dead, though modern historians debate the exact number, with some suggesting it might have been slightly lower. Even the most conservative modern estimates put the death toll at 20,000 or higher. For comparison, Hastings in 1066 killed perhaps 10,000 men. Total Waterloo in 1815 killed about 47,000, but involved far larger armies fighting with artillery and firearms. Nearly half of everyone who fought at Towton died there in the snow. The bodies literally carpeted the plateau. So many corpses lay in the trampled, bloody snow that burial parties worked for weeks afterward. Mass graves were hastily dug. Nobles were identified by their armor and heraldry and buried with some minimal ceremony. Common soldiers were simply piled into massive pits and covered over. The scale of death was so immense that the areas around Towton remained littered with human bones for decades. Farmers would find skulls and skeletons in their fields for generations. The Lancastrian army was utterly annihilated as a fighting force. The Duke of Somerset escaped the battlefield, but his entire power base was destroyed. The Earl of Northumberland was killed in the fighting. Dozens of Lancastrian nobles died in battle or were captured and executed immediately after King Henry VI, that helpless puppet, fled north to Scotland with Queen Margaret, now fugitives in what had been their own kingdom. Edward IV rode to York in triumph. The heads of Yorkist nobles, including his father's mocked head, were taken down from the city gates where they'd been displayed. Lancastrian heads replaced them in a reversal of fortune. So complete, it seemed almost biblical. Edward was crowned King of England, with no one left alive to challenge his claim. He was 19 years old and had secured his throne with the bloodiest battle in British history. But Towton didn't end the Wars of the Roses, as Edward might have hoped. The conflict would sputter on for another 24 brutal years, with periodic eruptions of violence. Henry VI would briefly reclaim the throne in 1470, before Edward won it back. Edward's brother Richard III would seize power after Edward's death, only to die at Bosworth Field in 1485, fighting against Henry Tudor. The wars only truly ended when Henry VII took the throne, and united the warring houses through marriage, creating the Tudor dynasty. Yet Towton remained forever the war's bloodiest day. No other battle in the Wars of the Roses came even remotely close to matching its carnage. It demonstrated something terrible about medieval warfare. When armies of similar size and capability met with absolute determination to win at any cost, when both sides knew that defeat meant death, the result was slaughter on an almost unimaginable scale. The battle also showed that weather and terrain could be as decisive as tactics or numbers. The snowstorm shaped everything. Falkenberg's arrow tactic only worked because of the wind. The exhaustion came partly from fighting in blizzard conditions. The difficulty of fleeing across frozen, bloody ground contributed to the massive casualties. Nature wasn't just a backdrop. It was an active participant in the killing. And perhaps most significantly, Towton proved that English nobles were willing to kill each other in staggering numbers over dynastic disputes. This wasn't foreign invasion or religious war or defense of the realm. This was Englishmen slaughtering other Englishmen by the tens of thousands because they disagreed about which nobleman should wear a crown. The aristocracy would spend the next century recovering from this self-inflicted bloodletting. Today, the fields of Towton are peaceful Yorkshire farmland. There's a small memorial chapel built in the 19th century, a monument erected in 1929. Archaeologists have found the mass graves, studied the bones with modern forensic techniques, and confirmed that the medieval chronicles weren't exaggerating the horror. The men buried at Towton show evidence of horrific trauma. Skulls split completely open by poleaxes, faces slashed to pieces by repeated sword cuts, bones cut nearly through by the force of blows. They died hard, fighting desperately in a snowstorm for causes most of them probably barely understood. Within 24 years of Towton, the Wars of the Roses would finally, mercifully end. A new dynasty, the Tudors, would take power and begin healing England's wounds, and the nation would carry forward a hard-learned lesson. Civil wars are won at costs that dwarf any possible benefits. We will cover this in future videos. That's what makes Towton matter today. Not the tactics or the commanders or who won and lost, but the simple, brutal, undeniable fact: 28,000 men died in a snowstorm because two families wanted the same crown, and all that bloodshed changed almost nothing except filling mass graves across Yorkshire. If this is the kind of history that fascinates you, the forgotten battles, the moments of unimaginable violence, the days that changed Britain through blood and snow, then you know what to do. This channel exists because these stories deserve to be told, no matter how brutal. What other forgotten battles should we uncover? More from the Wars of the Roses, the Scottish Independence Wars, the moments when Britain was forged in fire and blood? Drop your suggestions below. Thank you for watching Britain's history. The stories that mattered, told the way they deserved.